territory for all students and lecturers and educators as well. So I suppose without further ado, I would like to start today's theme of consciousness, which is about citizenship and responsibility. We've got a series of talks that connect the ideas of civil society, individual pursuits, purposeful livelihoods, and social contracts. And our first guest is not an architect, but a writer and environmentalist, Paul Kingsnorth. And he was known firstly to me through his writings in the Dark Mountain Manifesto called Uncivilization. And I suppose in these writings, Paul challenges us to question the foundations of our civilization as we have been taught for them, that we've been taught to believe that they are. And it's quite appropriate that today Paul's here with us on the first launch, as he was originally due to speak to us back in Linen Hall in April, following on from our Architectural Design for Climate Change initiative. And he was due to come in physically to meet with us and speak with us on the context of citizenship within the challenges of climate change. And now we find ourselves hit with another challenge, that of the pandemic. And so it's quite interesting as Paul's work has progressed over that time. His more recent piece called Finnegas, which references the old Celtic title, helps to contextualize his latest thinking on civilization during the pandemic. And I'd just like to read a few excerpts from that writing at the start here. Paul says, "I would like to tell you a few things about this virus and the lessons it should teach us, all the things we should be learning. I would like to add my voice to the crowd and be heard above it. I would like to say nature recovers swiftly when we stop plundering of her bounty. I would like to say lift your gaze, humans. I would like to say we can learn from this, we can change. I would like to say, well, we had it coming." In reading Paul's work, I find myself recalling back to familiar texts from when I was first struck by the idea of man and nature back in my American literature class when I was 13 in high school, principally the writing of Henry David Thoreau and his writings from Walden Pond. And I suppose over a year ago last September, when I was in a doctor's office waiting silently for my turn, I was struck by the fact that our students would be marching later that morning in the Dublin climate action strike. And I found myself going back to Thoreau's writings on civil disobedience. And Thoreau writes, "It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. The only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think is right. Even voting for the right is doing nothing for it. It is only expressing to men feebly your desire that it should prevail." And so I suppose I've asked Paul to come talk to us today about his thinkings on the individual with responsibility to the collective challenges that we're now all facing. And he's going to talk to us a bit about the meaning of apocalypse. So without further ado, Paul, I'd like to hand over to you now.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Always nice to be mentioned in the same paragraph as Thoreau, even if it's unjustified. But it's quite a good introduction, actually, because Thoreau, of course, as well as writing about liberty, actually made a real effort to live differently, and that's one of the things I would probably want to talk about a little bit here. But yeah, let's talk about apocalypse. So when you asked me to talk about, well, when you asked me to come and talk to you, my first feeling was I'm not an architect, so I probably haven't got anything useful to say at all. But I think broadly the themes that you're working on and the subjects you're talking about here are much applicable across society. So I thought, given the times we're living in, it seems like a good time to be talking about apocalypse. We are, and we think we are living in apocalyptic times. We have obviously climate change, which Jennifer mentioned there. We have all of the suite of other ecological problems associated with that. We have economic problems now, major economic problems with debt and the rest of it, we have an unsustainable way of life, effectively. And now we also have this virus coming along. So it can feel like a very apocalyptic time to be alive. But if we're going to talk like that, we have to look into what the word apocalypse means. And I think we have a general assumption that apocalypse means disaster. It means the end of the world. It means the collapse of everything. That's not what it means. It has a somewhat different meaning, which actually is a bit more interesting. The word apocalypse comes into the English language really through the Bible, which is where so many of our words come from. And it comes from the final book of the Bible, the famous book of Revelation, which is all about the end of the world. And that book is called the Apocalypse of St. John. And because that book is about the end of times, we tend to assume that that's what apocalypse means, but it doesn't. The original word apocalypsis from the Greek means revelation, literally. So what it means is that we get to see something which was previously hidden. So if we're living in apocalyptic times, what is it that we can see about our life, about our society, about our culture that was previously hidden, that maybe we couldn't see or we just didn't want to see? And I think that these 10 months or however long it's been of this virus and the way it's hit us all in our lives and our economies and our worldview has been very apocalyptic in that sense. It's revealed a great deal about our society and about our personal lives and about our attitudes that we maybe didn't have to look at before. And what it reveals is going to be different for all of us. But let me just give you 3 examples of what I think are revelations to me from the times that we're living in here, not just from the virus, but from the whole suite of issues that we are faced with: ecological issues, economic issues, the issues of the vast human economy and the vast number of people in it, and the pressures that come from that. And the virus in some ways has kind of laid bare things we could have seen already, but have in some ways been exacerbated by what's gone on. So I'll offer 3 personal views on this, and you can always discuss them yourselves and see what yours are. But think about that, as I say, unveiling. What is unveiled? What is revealed? So first one, since you brought up climate change, Jennifer, the first revelation to me is that you are climate change, and so am I, all of us. Okay, climate change is not a thing that is out there that somebody else is doing. It's a thing that you are. Okay, you're not just causing it, you are it. We are all it. First thing to think about when we think about climate change is that it isn't just an issue on its own. We often talk about climate change as if we could somehow stop it and that would make things all right. It wouldn't make things all right, because climate change is just one of a very much wider suite of symptoms, really, ecological symptoms of a disease that the planet is suffering from, which is currently the disease of human industrialization, really, and industrial and civilizational growth. Climate change is part of a much wider suite of issues. For example, we are currently in the 6th mass extinction event in the planet's history. There were 5 before. The last one was 60 million years ago when the dinosaurs died out, possibly caused by an asteroid. Today, the mass extinction is not being caused by an asteroid. It's being caused by humans and their way of life. So, for example, there was a report that came out last year from WWF, which revealed that since I was born in the early 1970s, which is longer ago than I'd like it to be, but it's still less than 50 years, humanity has killed off 60% of all mammals, birds, fish, and reptiles on the Earth. Okay, 60% in less than 50 years. It's an unprecedented collapse as far as we know. The most dramatic decline of all was found in Central and South America, where the wildlife populations have collapsed by 89%. Okay, 89% in less than 50 years. Over the last 10,000 years, which basically tracks the rise of human civilization, 83% of all wild mammals have been eliminated by human development. We have extinction rates that are 1,000 times higher than they were before this happened. And even if those extinction rates were returned to the pre-human level within the next half century, it would still take an estimated 5 to 7 million years for the natural world to recover, right? So there's just a few figures. I mean, you can spend all day pulling depressing figures like this out of the studies. And what they show you again and again and again is that climate change is part of a much bigger, effective attack, even if it's an unintentional attack, that humans are currently engaged in on the rest of life. Okay, so what's going on there? What's causing that? Is it corporations? Is it governments? Well, sort of, but it's also actually all of us. So what does that mean if we're actually out there demanding action for example. What are we actually going to do? What are we actually going to do? And how are we going to stop something that we are the cause of without changing ourselves? Okay, we are climate change. You are climate change. It's not somebody else's problem, it's yours and mine. We're causing it just by talking over this Zoomcast, okay? Here are 3 facts to illustrate that. Here's a good one. Internet data storage facilities currently emit roughly the same amount of greenhouse gas emissions as the entire global aviation industry, okay? The internet is as much of a problem as the airline industry, and it's growing very much faster. The internet will consume 1/5 of the world's electricity by 2025. In fact, it may get more than that, presumably now, since we've all been forced online by COVID. Okay, so the internet in itself, just the very act of us being online, checking our emails, playing with our phones, that is the problem. You can never get on a plane again. It doesn't make any difference if you're doing this instead. Fact number 2, offered by Jared Lanier, who was a former Microsoft computer scientist and an author, wrote a very good little book called You Are Not a Gadget. He's become a very tech skeptic man despite having helped to develop the technology. He estimated that if everyone in the world deleted all their social media accounts today, it would make a major contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Every time we're on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, or anywhere else, we are the problem. We are causing it. Every time we go on Twitter to tweet about how we want action on climate change, we're causing climate change, okay? Great that Greta Thunberg got on her yacht and went from Sweden to New York to prove that she didn't want to fly. Good thing, genuinely good thing. But if she's tweeting all the way there and being followed by a bunch of journalists who are also tweeting and producing stuff all over social media, she might as well have got on a plane, okay? Because the impact is much the same. That's not meant as a criticism of her particularly. It's meant as an illustration of how we're all part of this entwined problem. Fact number 3, this is the uncomfortable one, I suppose. Since that mass wipeout of wildlife beginning in the 1970s started to be measured, there have only been 2 occasions on which greenhouse gas emissions have fallen. Now, since 1992, since the first Earth Summit, governments have been signing up to endless deals and agreements that are supposed to reduce climate change. The latest one being the Paris Accord. Donald Trump famously pulled out of it. Joe Biden's famously going to get back into it. It won't make any difference to anything of any significance. There have only been 2 occasions on which we've actually reduced emissions. They've actually risen every year since 1992, except for the year, well, just before that, actually, the year 1990, which is when the Soviet Union collapsed, along with all of its industry, and the year 2008, when there was a major economic crisis and most of the world's economy nearly collapsed. It would be interesting to see whether the virus actually has reduced emissions as well. But the lesson, unfortunately, that we're learning is that however much we talk and sign documents and march in the streets, the only times things actually change is when the economy collapses, right? Because we don't actually want to change it very much at all, okay? And that's the issue here. We don't seem to want to change voluntarily. We enjoy talking about it, and we also enjoy finding people to blame for it, okay? We can blame the governments, for example, for not taking radical action to reduce emissions. But if the governments did take radical action to reduce emissions, they would have to prevent us from flying, prevent us from driving, tax us heavily on the fuel we use, and then we would be taking to the streets in very much larger numbers. Okay, similarly, corporations, we can blame the corporations, and we should. There's plenty to blame them for, but who's buying the stuff? We don't have to do that. The fact is we enjoy the lifestyle that is created by climate change, which means we are climate change. That's not a blame issue, actually, it's just an observation, which needs to be taken into account if we want to change it. Okay, so that's my first kind of revelation, which always makes me unpopular, but I think it's important to focus on. Why don't we change? Why don't we change unless things fall apart? Why do we want other people to change for us? Partly because we don't know what to do, because there aren't any easy answers to this at all. But the first thing I think that we have to do is recognize that reality. The climate change is all of us. It's not somebody else's problem, especially those of us in the rich world, of course. It's not all humans causing this, but certainly people like us are a big part of it. What would we be prepared to give up to prevent it from happening in our lives? That seems the big question to me. So that was my first revelation, my apocalyptic revelation from this year. The second one, perhaps related, but also slightly different. If the first one is you are climate change, the second one is you are the product. Okay, so here I'm talking about technology and its relationship to these issues. So our response to climate change is usually to call for more technology to solve the problem that technology has created. So in terms of climate change, we want more rollout of wind farms, we want more rollout of solar panels, perhaps we want more nuclear power, depending on who we're talking to. We want efficiency. It's always a desire for more efficiency, right? A similar response has happened, of course, in response to the virus. I mean, here we are using advanced technology to speak to each other rather than moving around and speaking to each other. And there's more and more of this all the time. It's a kind of get out of jail free card. We've built a hugely unsustainable economy and a hugely unsustainable civilization, which is mining nature at a rate of knots in a way that is literally unsustainable because it can't be sustained. And because we don't want to change, or we don't know how to change, we hope that technology will dig us out of the hole. Sometimes it does, mostly it doesn't. Often it digs us another hole. For example, it isn't possible at all to provide the energy intensity that's provided by fossil fuels with renewable energy. It's just not feasible. You could cover most of the world with solar panels and wind farms. That in itself would be an issue because you've smothered most of the wild places with technology, all of which are, of course, made from plastic, metal, and all the rest of it. But you still can't provide the energy intensity that we want in an economy that's growing, in which 10 billion people want access. Understandably, everybody wants this lifestyle. Why shouldn't they have it? Can you do it? No, you can't do it. There's no way. It's not feasible. You need 3 planets, it's been estimated, to actually provide the resources to provide this kind of lifestyle to 10 billion people. Okay, even if you have energy efficiency, even if you have increasing technology, it isn't feasible in any way that's yet been discovered, even if it was practically possible to do it in time. With oil having peaked 15 years ago and with climate change moving so fast that we only have supposedly 15 or 20 years to radically reduce emissions in order to make it to keep it below 2 degrees, which is already seeming less likely. Okay, so actually we're being pushed all the time into a more tech-dependent lifestyle. COVID is a good example of this. Here we are all working on screens. If and when this virus is over, many of us are going to remain working on screens. It saves companies from having to rent office spaces. So we're kind of locked into this stuff all the time. And we're moving into the age of smart technology, right? Smart buildings, smart streets, Alexa, the fridge that will order your milk for you. This is all sold as convenience, and maybe it is convenient, but of course what it also is total monitoring. Every single aspect of your lives tied up to the internet, monitored and controlled potentially. They do this very effectively in China with their social credit system at the moment, where everybody is connected to everything and you're only given credits by the government if you behave in certain ways. It's not entirely unfeasible that some version of that will end up existing in the West, not run by the government, but certainly run by corporations who already know what we give them. We are the product. When we're on social media again, we are handing over all of our information voluntarily to corporations who are using it very deliberately. There's rather a good documentary on Netflix at the moment, ironically, called The Social Dilemma, which is rather good on this. And it's interviews with many of the people who created social media, talking about how they designed it and how they came to change their mind about its impact, because it's designed deliberately to be addictive. We go on there, we get into what are called Ludic Loops. We get our dopamine centers of our brain hit as we get addicted to the likes and the retweets, and we hand over all of our information. If a government tried to take off us physically through the use of force, the amount of information we give to Mark Zuckerberg, I imagine there would be a revolution, but we give it to him voluntarily. And every single one of us has a very clear personal profile built up by these companies. So we are handing over our information voluntarily, and that is being used to create a giant network of effectively consumer technology, which will sell things to us. Okay, I don't know if anyone's done one of those fun DNA tests where you can find out whether you're descended from Vikings or people from China. If you have done that, you've handed over all of your genetic information to a corporation in perpetuity. Maybe they will keep their privacy agreement and maybe they won't, but it's not coming back again. So I wouldn't fancy it myself. The point is, we're sold all this as consumers, but we're not consumers, we're products. The phone in your pocket is tracking you. Your social media accounts are taking all of your information, all of your political views, all of your consumer views, and creating a specific market profile for you. When you link all that up into the smart technology that will be able to spot who you are when you're walking down the street and advertise things for you, you are looking at a world of a kind of eco Blade Runner world. That's what the future is taking us. And we can see how quickly that's been accelerated by this, and will continue to be accelerated by the need to try and stop climate change and the other problems which this technological society is creating for us. So we are climate change, and we are the product We are the product that is being sold increasingly back to ourselves in this increasingly techno-civilization which we are unable to escape from. So those are my first two revelations. And my third revelation, my final one, I suppose, is perhaps the more Thorovian one. And this is that if you are climate change and you are the product, then also you are the alternative to it, right? You are the person who can change things, but you won't change things by marching in the street, or at least you won't change much like that. And you won't change things by tweeting either. You'll only change things by actually changing things, as Thoreau did. So Thoreau wrote his book on civil disobedience, and he told people how to protest, and he told people how not to protest, and he told them the limits of voting, and he gave them a sense of principle. But he also spent a year living in a very simple way in his hut at Walden Pond and showed everybody how they could actually live and tried to do it himself. It's the conclusion I've come to ultimately through all of this over many years is that the fundamental thing that people need to do actually in their lives is do less actually and make do with less. Live more simply, close down your social media accounts. Don't imagine that logging in and talking more loudly than everybody else is going to solve the problem. There is no solution to what is happening unless we're prepared to take some level of personal responsibility as people and as communities to actually live differently. Okay, the governments are not going to take any action at all if we don't show them we're prepared to make do with less, which actually is what we in the rich world need to do. We need to make do with considerably less. We would have to use, in the rich world, in a country like Ireland or any European country, it's been estimated we would have to use about 90% less energy than we use at the moment if you were to move forward to a world where climate change could actually be prevented, where emissions could be reduced at the same time as other parts of the world could have a reasonable level of development, right? So we would actually have to reduce our energy use by 90%. That's not coming through technology. That's coming through changing our way of life. So we have to think about what we take for granted, what we use, what we do, and how we live. It's a hard thing to do, but the question for me is how do we get past this great myth of progress that keeps us all stuck in the belief that technology will save us? How do we change our lives? How do we declare some independence from this machine that's around us? That's the alternative. And unless we start to do that individually, however difficult it might be, then I don't think very much changes. So those are my three apocalyptic revelations. So I probably depressed you enough. So I'll shut up at this point and pass on to Mike. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Paul. That was interesting. It was really interesting to hear. You know, we are climate change. We are the products that are being sold back to ourselves, and this whole idea of what to do, we'll do less. I'm reading at the moment Tim Jackson's Prosperity Without Growth, and it really taps into that whole question about quality as opposed to quantity. And the whole idea of prosperity or progress, as you refer to it, is what is progress? And I suppose that's for each of us to answer and to find out. And I suppose in a way, architecture is going through all of those sort of philosophical questions itself as well. We've got a number of major curriculum revisions and overhauls being considered at national and European and international level. And it is to say, what is progress for architecture? And a lot of the conclusions and discussion are around, the discrepancies of agenda between, let's say, the Sustainable Development Goals, which in its right concludes that progress is still about development, and actually development in its own right is about more or growth, as opposed to less, which can also be growth of a different kind. Is it a growth of quality, etc.? So I suppose in some ways your response to do less has answered one of my main questions to you, which is, Finnegas leaves us kind of wanting to know what next, or how do we proceed from here? And if it is to do less, how do we do less better than we're currently doing now? What does that mean around the question of quality? So I'll hold the questions in the chat until the end, until Mike Haslem, our next speaker, has spoken, and we might take a few overall questions from the group, having heard from Mike as well. Mike is a practicing architect, and he's also, we're very lucky to have him as a lecturer in TU Dublin. Mike's always operated within the limits and designed within the limits of the environment. I met him back a long time ago, and in my early teaching years, and in 2009 he and Brian O'Brien put forward the 10 commandments to the Dublin School of Architecture, DIT at the time. And it was quite a radical proposal for 2009, because it essentially bound students in their design processes, and it bound the lecturers in their duty designing briefs to a set of limitations and targets in terms of prioritizing the environment and sustainability, material limitations, and at that time, zero carbon targets. The commandments were radical, and it also proposed that no project should ever proceed to the next stage of development had it not satisfied in the very first instance those principles. And I suppose we've continuously sought to try and address that through our teaching, but only some 10 years later did those 10 commandments get resurrected, more recently through the initiatives that the school and the lecturers and the students have been working on together, following a series of events from the Architecture for Climate Change co-creation sessions. And I suppose with that, Mike might describe some of his recent works, and I know an older project as well, one of the first projects I think I ever saw you present at DIT, in terms of what an architecture of hope looks like if we are talking about progress in the sense of doing less and being conscious citizens as to how we approach architecture. So Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, it was good to see. It was good to see the 10 commandments come back and be quizzed as well, and to some degree shaken around and perhaps revisited and reworked. I wanted to show a PowerPoint, so I think I can share the screen. Okay, so two competitions that. One which is of this year, and another which is about 20 years ago, and they were both, I suppose, what they were both asking. This one is from the RIBA earlier this year, and the second one is from the UIA, as I say, 20 years ago. Both were trying to address a set of issues, or asking us actually very broad questions, and you had to define your agenda to answer them. And the first one here, and I suppose implied in that is both were asking, so what can design contribute? Can it contribute anything positive to alleviating issues such as, in this particular one, which was the Rethink 2025, which was really a response to COVID, but it was also asking us sort of more generally what happens environmentally, how should architecture change? And it was interesting, the entry that we did with Seamus, who I think is listening in today. Hello, Seamus. Was to one could look strategically, and some of the entries did. Some of the shortlisted entries were looking strategically at a very broad scale, which was equally interesting, if not more so. What we chose to do, though, was to go, well, okay, what are we in control of, and what can we maybe do on a very simple level? And I'll just read a few bits actually to you, if you don't mind. This is from the design statement we put in. So it was called "Far Off is Close at Hand," and what has happened to our state of interdependence. I was following on from a quote from Edgar Morin, who makes the point that the alpha idea of all ecological thought is that the independence of living being necessitates its dependence within its environment. What can be termed our state of interdependence? So what's happened to this? We've come out of our gym into the park, repurposing the outdoor spaces. We have come out of our offices and into our homes. Our daily commute is a walk to another room. We have reshown that we do not need to be commuting to be productive. We have reshown we do not need to be traveling physically to be traveling in the mind. Our far off is now close at hand. And then I go on to ask, so what are the spatial realignments? Are they strategic, or could they be much more to do with how we occupy the space we call home? And with an increasingly populated world, as Paul mentioned, we cannot renounce dense living, but must strategize our design so that space and privacy are protected, and spatial quality goes hand in hand with quantity. So then the proposal was, if home is again a more dominant part of our spatial existence, then we can define a place to sit and daydream, a perch on the street in the world. If our far off is to be close at hand, then a sky view that allows us to breathe and watch clouds becomes more critical. If home is to be a deeper sanctuary, then does reinforcing the sense of nest become more important? If working becomes more video-based, can our workspaces positively exchange with the public realm? If the transition between these states needs to be recognized and ritualized, can washing reflect this? So this is the design here as a framework, a box, if you like, which was looking at 4 elements, I suppose, as I've mentioned. So the nest here, which is a sense of sanctuary, our sense of withdrawal. The perch, which I borrowed from Shigeru Ban, I must admit, here out onto the street. And then washing as the ritualized entry and exit from a change of public world to private world. And then this, which I call the bar of exchange, and I'll just move on to the next slide here. The bar of exchange was very much about how we might, in fact, it was based on what I'd observed around the city over lockdown, the first lockdown, which was that people were using windowsills for all manner of things, for serving drinks, for chatting with neighbors, and potentially for exchanging work as well, as in documents could be gazed at, etc. And the idea that there's an external world and an internal world that could meet between a threshold, which I call the bar of exchange, with a porch, and this world could be a work world behind, or it could be a living world behind, but that there is a ritualized, if you like, threshold. And this went on to a very quickly done Photoshop here, which was again about, so maybe if our high streets are starting to fall to pieces and not have the same agenda as in sale and commodity sale, perhaps these spaces can become revitalized by this bar of exchange, that potentially behind here is a workspace or a living space, but at some stage you can fold back the shutters, you can open up, and you can engage with the wider public. So that was the first one I wanted to show you, which was, as I say, a sort of rethinking, strategizing idea. The last one, or the second and last, is a competition from 1999, which was UIA ran a competition called something along the lines of the architecture and the eradication of poverty, and it was to see whether one can design something that is appropriate and applicable and useful. And everybody was, there was a wide range of inputs into this competition. I mean, very different strategies. I took the line that we should look at something quite tangible, and it was based on some research I'd been doing independently, which was looking at desertification in the Sahel Savannah, a band running across from Central African Republic through Chad, Mali, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, and looking at both the increasing desertification and the resultant poverty that this was causing. And without going into too much detail, it was a locally, or the idea was a system, a locally built system that was about, first of all, about simple clearance, field clearance, if you like, and establishing these tessellating hexagon structures, which was a field pattern in some respects to protect the ground within. And then it was based on a couple of principles. One was about drawing cold air through nighttime cold air through some ditches effectively in the ground and up a stack, so encouraging a flow of air through, and then encouraging to condensing the small amount of water vapor in the atmosphere within and on the cooler stones within these trenches, which you can see being dug out here. And that this area was protected by a twine and palm frond tensile, very simple tensile structure that spanned out from the chimney, and that protection would allow the growing of acacia trees, and then the planting, feeding off these trenches, planting of things like millet and sorghum. And by the time that this simple tensile structure has started to decay, the acacia trees have grown to provide their own shelter, and the system is starting to work on its own. And that this then potentially becomes a boundary or a whole set of enclosures running east-west. So I'll finish there. The ideas on both were really about, and I have to say there's a certain amount of, as I found out later as I pursued this, a certain amount of naivety in them. But I think what both were trying to do was look at whether design can positively contribute. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. That was great. I mean, I think, you know, you've touched on quite a number of the points that Paul had raised, and I suppose I wouldn't mind just talking about what your last project really spoke to, which was this time horizon. And in terms of the longevity of the project itself and the sort of the transformation that the project undergoes as the trees mature and the structure collapses, and just that idea of the built-in decay or life cycle, if you like, of the overall understanding of the project, to be aware of its overall duration. And I suppose you know, one of the challenges, I suppose, that COVID is posing for a lot of people is that, you know, there's a mentality that this is a short-term situation, when in fact people are making decisions that may, as Paul is saying, have a long-term effect, you know, in that we've proven we can stay operating and productive through the enhanced technologies that we rely on. And I suppose the question is around, you know, what is going to be able to endure if we are to try and find a way through this, not necessarily out of this or returning back to the kind of optimum ecological state, but a way through in the medium term. And I suppose, I guess I would ask that question of you, Mike, and then of you, Paul, as well, in terms of how time plays a factor in this, in terms of the human capacity to make change and to adhere to new expectations, in a sense.
Well, yeah. Certainly the whole idea of the eco catalyst, as I called it, was that it was. Yeah, we actually mentioned Brian earlier on, and certainly in the early days of our joint practice, we were talking a lot about ecostructures as opposed to infrastructure. And I think this was an early attempt to do something that had, if you like, an architectural form to start with. That was hence the catalyst. It was to try and kickstart something. Which in this particular case was an ecology. It was trying to kickstart an ecology in an area that needed help, and that once nature has got a hold again, it can architecture can bow out to some degree. And I suppose I was kind of in a Pyrenean kind of romantic way. I was thinking of yeah, maybe all that's left of this is a field boundary, which was to stop or to inhibit the overgrazing, and then a series of slightly decaying chimneys that would be scattered across the desert, or sorry, what was the desert, what shouldn't be the desert, but surrounded by vegetation. And so there was a sort of idea of monument, but that I naively perhaps was thinking, okay, these are monuments to an ecology, and that's what it was trying to do.
Interesting. Monument. The word monument kind of conjures all sorts of.
Yeah, we had a good discussion about the other day. Monument being not necessarily a positive thing.
Exactly. Paul, what are your thoughts on time horizon with respect to that?
Ozymandias, that, isn't it? You know, the famous poem by Shelley, Ozymandias, where I am Ozymandias, king of kings. Look on my work, ye mighty, and despair, but all that's left is a broken statue of somebody nobody can remember. Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in what Mike was saying there, because it's, in a way, it seems to me actually quite it's almost a vernacular approach, or at least it kind of mirrors it, because vernacular architecture almost anywhere in the world obviously works very closely with the natural world, because it's just built from it on a very small scale. And I'm interested in that kind of appropriate technology, as we used to call it in the green movement, and how that actually works from a human scale. And so much of this is about scale. Actually, almost this entire discussion is about scale, and the whole of our problem is about scale. What scale are we actually going to work on? And what are our values? What values are we working to? I mean, I've heard the word productive being used a couple of times, as if the purpose of a human being was to be productive. Well, that's exactly the problem I was trying to talk about earlier when I talked about us becoming a product. We live in this utilitarian culture in which we're being treated like machines. And what's the future? We sit in our bedrooms looking at screens and being maximally productive. I mean, that pretty much is the future, until they've invented robots which can do our jobs for us, which is also coming down the road. So what's the value here? What's the value? The bigger a society gets, and the more complex and the more top down, the less power we have, and the less able we are to come up with vernacular solutions. Now, we're at the point now where it's basically almost impossible to do anything at a vernacular scale, because things have got so big, and it's difficult to know what to do about that. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that actually, a quick anecdote. There's a book by Thomas Friedman, the American journalist, very kind of famous sort of neoliberal journalist, who wrote a book about the eco-technological solutions to the eco-crisis a few years ago. And he'd come up with he was talking about how brilliant technology was and how it was going to be able to solve the problems that we have now. So, for example, you could have your smart house set up so that when the sun came out and the wind started to blow, the solar panel on your roof would take in the sunlight, and the little wind turbine on your roof would take in the wind, and that would click in automatically and turn on your washing machine, right? So your washing machine would only run when the sun and the wind were blowing, and this was presented as a wonderful technological solution. The environmentalist Bill McKibben reviewed this book, and he said, well, I suppose that could work, or you could go down to the hardware shop and buy yourself a bit of string for $2, hang it outside, and when the wind blows and the sun comes, hang your clothes on that. And it was just a good example of actually the obsession with kind of top-down high-tech solutions to things which can actually often be simple. And I keep coming down to this issue of scale. You know, if we create an enormous top-down technological society, then all the solutions will have to be that scale as well. But they'll end up creating more problems that we have to solve at that scale as well. And eventually the whole thing gets top-heavy, which is pretty much where we are now.
I mean, before we move on, because I think that's an important distillation of kind of the major themes running through what we're talking about. Steph had a question in the chat box which related back to that question of scale and the individual sort of as part of the collective. Steph, did you want to summarize your question as such? It was about kind of, you know, what's the starting point for a response? Is it individually? Is it collectively? Is it both?
Yeah, I suppose, like, in brief summary, I feel like a lot of the discourse around climate change is that it is an individual issue, and that the individual has the power to change things if we all just collectively act as individuals in a certain way. And I feel like, to an extent, that it might be a starting point, but I don't know if that will actually fundamentally achieve the sort of systemic change, which feels like is also a sort of a point here. And I don't know if what Paul is getting at is the fact that there is no system, and that the system is in fact just a collection of individuals. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, that gets to the nub of the matter, actually. I mean, look, individual action isn't going to change anything on a global scale. Obviously, me deciding not to go on a plane ever again, or closing down all my social media accounts,
Yeah.
in that sense, in that kind of utilitarian sense, it doesn't change anything. No. And actually, I think it's good to start off from the realistic but difficult perspective that actually nothing that's happening at the moment is going to change the system in that big way, right? That we've been trying to work as collective governments for 25 years. That's not working. Market forces aren't working, and our individual actions aren't working, in the sense that if we define working as reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 90% tomorrow, then nothing's going to work, right? Because that's pretty much what we're presented with now, okay? So in that sense, in that sort of mathematical way, none of this is going to work, absolutely. But society isn't a collection of individuals, obviously, or it's not just a society at all. So the question is not, what do we do that will work? I don't think on that global scale, but what do we do that's right? And how do we actually build a society at the local level, at the vernacular level, that will be different? It's not so much looking at how to change things on that systemic scale. It's looking at how you can do things differently. I think, personally, that's my conclusion, on not just an individual level at all, but on a community level. Because firstly, you have to build resilience in, right? Because we're not going to stop climate change now. So we've got a very difficult several centuries coming up of all sorts of mess, and we don't know how bad it's going to get. So we've got to build systems that can actually get through that. And we've got to live ourselves in ways that allow us to sort of deal with that psychologically, ecologically, locally. So it's not a question of, let's all turn off our phones tomorrow because that will stop climate change. It won't, obviously. But we are living at the moment in this giant machine, which doesn't give us any power to really do anything. And which also makes us vulnerable, because if this does get hit, what do we do? I mean, if we're all linked up to our Zoom pods all day and the electricity goes off, well, who's going to feed us? To me, it's a question of creating resilient communities in some way. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. I don't have any prescriptions for anybody. But I think maybe that's just also a question of flipping around the assumption that we have to have a big top-down solution. Sometimes we do. I'm not entirely against that. I'm not suggesting there shouldn't be meetings and conferences. But also, maybe a lot of this actually starts from the bottom up. Maybe we have to show how to live differently at this point. Because I haven't got a better idea, put it that way. Because otherwise we're just kind of sitting here waiting for someone else to solve a problem which they're manifestly not solving, So that would be my perspective. But it's a very good question, though.
Yep. Okay. Well, on the building resilience piece, I think that's a nice segue actually over to what was the first student segment of the show, called Common Ground. And Paul, for your benefit and anyone else who's joining in, the original intent of this that Hugh had described back at the heads of school meeting back in August was actually to try and build this sense of connectivity across the schools of Ireland with the students who would be feeling this sense of disconnectedness at this time. And so I suppose as a way to try and bolster that resilience within our own communities of practice and communities of learning, Alana had a wonderful idea, which was to try and connect students over some of the common challenges that they all face in their studio projects and in their thinking and their design processes. So with that, I'll hand over to Alana Brunton, a Master of Architecture student at TU Dublin, who is also a broadcaster. So thanks, Alana.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, Jennifer. Good afternoon to everyone. And I just wanted to say as well, Paul Kingsnorth and Mike Haslem, thanks for those very thought-provoking discussions. And again, a bit like this segment, very relatable to us all, architects, students and beyond. Yeah, today is largely going to be an introduction to this segment. So I'm delighted to be broadcasting on the current Zoomcast across the architecture schools. Again, my name is Alana Brunton and I'm a first year student on the Masters of Architecture programme, the MArch, in the Dublin School of Architecture here in TU Dublin. I am the curator and host, as Jennifer mentioned, of the student segment Common Ground. I was eager to jump on board, being involved in broadcasting and presenting on Dublin City FM for the last few years. I'll be on this Saturday 1 to 2 p.m. Shameless plug there. So just to give all the proof. So yeah, thanks again for the encouraging and kind words and assistance in developing the idea, Jennifer Boyer and Dr. Brian Ward as well, and by extension Hugh Campbell for setting up the Zoomcast. This sounds like an acceptance speech, so I'll just get into the actual content. I'm happy to introduce this highly anticipated student segment, Common Ground. I'd like to think it's highly anticipated, so I'm going to run with that. So I guess to give a bit of background, in a way I'm sharing knowledge from one of the first books in my architectural library, 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School by Matthew Frederick. I'm sure this book is not the first, it's not the first time anyone has seen that. So I was first introduced to this book when I was a first year student of architecture in Limerick by Jan Froberg. So hi Jan and all the students and teaching faculty at UL. So this book really left an impression on me. Then I transferred to Dublin School of Architecture, TU Dublin, for my second year to carry out the remainder of my studies, and hence why I'm sitting here now speaking to you. When I transferred, I was more or less bombarded with questions from students, whether this be from Limerick, from Saul, or Dublin School of Architecture, about the day-to-day experiences, the studio setups, with regards to modules. Are studies more difficult here, there? Is it conceptual based? Is it teaching based kind of thing? And it got me thinking that there is actually, again, to plug the segment, a lot of common ground between both schools. So we're, and I'm presuming across all the schools, we're very much alike in the sense that we encounter the same common architectural teaching. So yeah, of course, each school is unique in its own way. I'm not taking away from that. And there's various other factors that influence how they can kind of have niche differences. But some lessons from the book will perhaps strip away these layers, and we can share little tips and teachings that we all stumble across in architecture school, this kind of common ground, again, that I'm talking about. So it's more or less a segment of kind of things we all learn in architecture school, to reiterate that again. The actual publication of the book may not be very current, but it was published in 2007, but it's, I think, definitely something that's very current for first years embarking on their architectural journey and those in the midst of it. And I hope it, engages students and teachers alike. It's relatable. It's going to be an informal conversation at the end of the Zoomcast about how, the studio affects us, architecture affects us. And I hope it might even bring in a few listeners that just have a general interest in architecture or want to do it to get those views up. So yeah, again, I wanted to be kind of as open to everyone and accessible. So I'll show some examples from the 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School book, but I just wanted to throw out that, this is kind of, again, the benchmark, but if you want to bring other books to the segment that you felt were kind of like helped you with your architectural learning. So I think the kind of simple, 101, architectural environmental design concepts kind of books, or urban code, again, you have this kind of 101 tips, like a simple phrase and maybe a sketch that goes along with the book, and you can then elaborate on it with your own work and your own rough work and kind of get a conversation going. Yeah, I think it's just worth mentioning as well, this is the 99% Visible podcast, just because this is this is an architectural broadcast, and this would be one of the most famous architectural podcasts. They brought out a book, and if anyone would like to maybe take a look at that and just see how they, they're doing they're doing a point, they're making a point, and then they're showing a nice sketch, which is kind of maybe what we're trying to aim for on this student segment. So there are just a few ideas, but yes, the benchmark is 101 things I learned in architecture school. So I might go ahead then and screen share if I'm able to do so. Great stuff. Okay, so yeah, again, just to reiterate, that yeah, these are a few books bringing that I'll happily have people bring forward, or please enlighten me on any that you might have stumbled across with in your architectural learning. Yeah, so we might just then jump into show a quick sample of the kind of thing I'm talking about here. So for instance, maybe we'll talk just a bit about the figure ground. Lesson 2, a figure is an element or shape placed on a page, canvas, or other background. Ground is the space of the page. So I'm going to throw it back to first year, just to show that you don't have to bring forth your best ever drawing, rough work sketches, great, because at the end of the day, that's what we see most of, really. So this is my first ever figure ground. I did it in first year. We did a spatial intervention project in Kilrush in County Clare. This would have been my first reaction to a figure ground. So yeah, Annie, I doubt this is the best one you've ever seen. So please do not be afraid to share kind of your early work on the segment, informal, relatable. We've all done something like this. Yeah, I plopped a nice proposal there in the center of the Market Street. But again, this was all about learning about what the figure ground is, and yeah, the spaces, positive and negative, that we're creating. Then my own little take from this is that the ground is a space on the page, but it can also be the space that you cast. So this would have been my first experience with doing the whole chemistry, that is coming up with a plaster cast, getting the case, the messiness that comes with that. But again, it's a lesson that certainly stuck in my mind. Then my second ever figure ground. So as you can see, I made a huge improvement. Spent an awful long time hatching this one. I'm sure that's no stranger to anyone in our architecture school either. So yeah, this is the Plaza Mayor in Salamanca. We were doing an urban rooms investigation. And then I went back to the plaster cast, and I also got a bit more familiar with that. And I have to say, I think there's probably a bit of an improvement on that one too. Back to the figure ground again, just lesson 3. Figure ground theory states that the space results from placing figures, and it should be considered carefully as the figures themselves. So this is just jumping to second year, a project that we did. This would have been when I transferred. It was on Bolton Street, and again, just looking at these kind of positive and negative spaces you create. This project was obviously about I don't know how obvious it is. I was very, very close to the project at the time, so it's obvious to me. But making a very small entry from the street, a very narrow entrance into this courtyard housing scheme. And again, just showing the rough work and the sketches that kind of led to this figure ground, and kind of how they all work in concert to develop your final idea. And yeah, just showing a bit of my work from first and second year, and how these lessons and tips had an effect on me. So that's just a little taste of how you might want to run through the segment. Again, I know, or I'm hitting about 10 minutes now. We're going a little bit over the time, but I suppose this segment is, I would love more students to contribute to it. This is a benchmark. It can adapt and grow outside these parameters. Again, it's going to be eventually student led. So I would love if you got in contact with me via my student email, or if you got in contact with Jennifer and she can link you up with me, and you could come on and maybe we could have a chat about how these certain lessons affected you. I will welcome any contributions with open, sanitized arms. So please do get in touch. And yeah, I hope that more or less clears everything up. So this has been Common Ground. I'm your host, Alana Brunton. It's inspired by 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School by Matthew Frederick. Don't forget to tune in on Wednesday to the TU Dublin takeover of the current Zoomcast. And I'll see you then. Thank you.
Thanks, Alana. Thanks so much. And I know that time is up, so I would just like to extend my gratitude to Paul Kingsnorth, to Mike Haslem, to Alana Brunton for making today our first broadcast. And although I think we touched on some quite deep topics, things that are all very much ever present for us at this time. I think we did do them some justice, even though the time was quite short. So if there are any further feedbacks or follow-ups from today's segment, feel free to contact me or Alana as well on the Common Ground session. And Hugh, I'll hand back over to you, and thanks so much to everyone who made today possible.